Hello everyone. In this video we are going to discuss respiratory acidosis, one of the major disorders of acid-base balance. To understand respiratory acidosis clearly, we first need to remember that the human body continuously produces acids as a result of normal metabolism. Respiratory acidosis is a primary acid-base disorder in which inadequate alveolar ventilation causes retention of carbon dioxide, resulting in an increase in arterial partial pressure of carbon dioxide and a decrease in blood pH. Normally, the arterial blood pH is maintained between 7.35 and 7.45. The normal arterial partial pressure of carbon dioxide is approximately 35 to 45 mmHg, while the normal plasma bicarbonate concentration is approximately 22 to 26 milliequivalents per liter. Therefore, the characteristic changes in respiratory acidosis are decrease in pH and increase in arterial partial pressure of carbon dioxide. Why does carbon dioxide cause acidosis? To understand respiratory acidosis, we must understand the relationship between carbon dioxide, carbonic acid, hydrogen ions, and bicarbonate. Carbon dioxide is continuously produced in the body tissues during cellular metabolism. This carbon dioxide enters the blood and is transported to the lungs, where it is normally eliminated through expiration. In the body, carbon dioxide participates in the following reversible reaction. In this reaction, carbon dioxide combines with water to form carbonic acid. This reaction is greatly facilitated by the enzyme carbonic anhydrase, which is present in several tissues, particularly red blood cells and renal tubular cells. Carbonic acid is a weak acid and dissociates into hydrogen ions and bicarbonate ions. Now, under normal conditions, the amount of carbon dioxide is carefully regulated by the lungs. However, when ventilation becomes inadequate, carbon dioxide is retained in the body. As PaCO2 increases, more carbon dioxide is available to combine with water and form carbonic acid. As the hydrogen ion concentration increases, the pH decreases. Therefore, respiratory acidosis is fundamentally a disorder caused by the failure of the respiratory system to eliminate sufficient carbon dioxide. The next important concept is alveolar ventilation. Respiratory acidosis is specifically related to inadequate alveolar ventilation and not simply to the breathing rate. Alveolar ventilation refers to the amount of fresh air that reaches the alveoli and participate in gas exchange per minute. The alveoli are the sites where oxygen enters the blood and carbon dioxide is removed from the blood. The relationship between PaCO2 and alveolar ventilation can be expressed as PaCO2 is proportional to carbon dioxide production by alveolar ventilation. This means that if the production of carbon dioxide remains relatively constant and alveolar ventilation decreases, PaCO2 will increases. Therefore, decreased alveolar ventilation leads to increased PaCO2. On the other hand, if alveolar ventilation increases, more carbon dioxide is eliminated through the lungs, resulting in a decrease in PaCO2. Thus, increased alveolar ventilation which leads to decreased PaCO2. It is important to understand that hyperventilation does not necessarily mean slow breathing. A person may have a normal respiratory rate but still have inadequate alveolar ventilation. For example, if the person takes very shallow breath, much of the inspired air may remain in the anatomical dead space rather than reaching the alveoli effectively. Similarly, disorders affecting the respiratory muscles, chest walls, airways, or lungs may reduce effective alveolar ventilation even when the respiratory rate appears normal. Therefore, respiratory acidosis develops when effective alveolar ventilation becomes insufficient to eliminate the carbon dioxide produced by cellular metabolism. Now we'll see about pathophysiology of respiratory acidosis. It can be understood by step. The first event is reduced alveolar ventilation. This reduction may occur because of respiratory center depression, neuromuscular weakness, airway obstruction, chest wall abnormalities, or severe pulmonary disease. Because ventilation is inadequate, the lungs cannot eliminate the normal amount of carbon dioxide. As a result, carbon dioxide begins to accumulate in the arterial blood. This produces increased PaCO2. The increase in PaCO2 is referred to as hypercapnia. The retained carbon dioxide then combines with water molecule and to form carbonic acid. The carbonic acid then dissociate into hydrogen ions and bicarbonate. As a result, the hydrogen ion concentration increases. Since pH is inversely related to hydrogen ion concentration, an increase in hydrogen ion causes a decrease in blood pH. Now we'll move on to causes of respiratory acidosis. Respiratory acidosis can occur due to any condition that produces significant alveolar hyperventilation. These causes can be understood under several major categories. The first category involves depression of the respiratory center in the brain. Normally, the respiratory centers in the brainstem regulate the rate and depth of breathing. If the centers are suppressed, the respiratory drive decreases. As a result, ventilation becomes inadequate and carbon dioxide is retained. Central nervous system depression may occur due to sedative drugs, opioid overdose, general anesthesia, severe brain injury, or certain neurological conditions. And the second important group of causes includes neuromuscular disorders. Normal ventilation requires the coordinated activity of the respiratory center, peripheral nerves, neuromuscular junctions, respiratory muscles, and chest wall. If the respiratory muscles are weak or if neuromuscular transmission is impaired, the patient may not be able to expand the lungs adequately. Conditions such as myasthenia gravis, Guillain-Barré syndrome, spinal cord disorders, and severe muscle weakness can impair respiratory muscle function. As a result, alveolar ventilation decreases, carbon dioxide is retained, and respiratory acidosis may develop. Then third one is airway obstruction can also cause respiratory acidosis when it becomes severe. Examples include severe asthma, advanced chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, and upper airway obstruction. In severe airway obstruction, airflow into and out of the lungs becomes difficult. Initially, a patient may compensate by increasing respiratory effort. However, when the obstruction becomes severe or respiratory muscles become fatigued, effective ventilation may decrease. As a result, carbon dioxide elimination becomes inadequate. And the respiratory acidosis can also occur in conditions that prevent adequate expansion of the lungs. Examples include severe chest wall abnormalities, obesity-related hypoventilation, and conditions associated with severe restriction of chest movements. In these orders, the lungs may not expand sufficiently during inspiration. Consequently, alveolar ventilation decreases and carbon dioxide is retained. Next, we'll see about acute respiratory acidosis. Respiratory acidosis may be classified as acute or chronic, depending on the duration of carbon dioxide retention. Acute respiratory acidosis develops rapidly, usually over minutes to hours. Since the increase in PaCO2 occurs suddenly, the kidneys do not have sufficient time to provide significant compensation. Initially, the body depends mainly on chemical buffer system. These includes intracellular proteins, hemoglobin, phosphate, and other buffering systems. When hydrogen ion increase, some of these hydrogen ions are buffered by proteins and other intracellular buffers. As a result, the fall in pH is partially limited. However, this immediate buffer system cannot completely correct the acidosis. Therefore, acute respiratory acidosis is characterized by decreased pH, increased PaCO2, and only a small increase in bicarbonate concentration. For example, suppose a person develops sudden respiratory depression due to an overdose of respiratory depressant drug. The respiratory rate and depth decrease, alveolar ventilation falls, and carbon dioxide begins to accumulate rapidly. because the kidneys requires time to adapt. Significant renal compensation has not yet occurred. Therefore, acute respiratory acidosis may produce a marked decrease in blood pH. Next one is chronic respiratory acidosis. It develops over a longer period, generally several days or more. The major difference between acute and chronic respiratory acidosis is the development of renal compensation. When PaCO2 remains elevated for a prolonged period, the kidney gradually adapts to the increased acid load. The kidney responds in several ways. Initially, they increase the secretion of hydrogen ions into the renal tubular fluid. Then they increase the reabsorption of filtered bicarbonate. They generate new bicarbonate and add it into the extracellular fluid. Then they increase the production and excretion of ammonium. These mechanisms increase the plasma bicarbonate concentration and help compensate for the increased carbon dioxide. The increase in bicarbonate partially restores the ratio between bicarbonate and carbon dioxide. As a result, the pH moves closer towards the normal range. Compensation does not eliminate the primary disorder. The primary abnormality, which is increased PaCO2, remains present unless the underlying respiratory problem is corrected. Thus, chronic respiratory acidosis usually shows increased PaCO2, increased bicarbonate, a pH that is reduced but often less severely than in acute respiratory acidosis. Kidneys play a major role in compensating for chronic respiratory acidosis. However, renal compensation is relatively slow compared with respiratory responses because it requires changes in renal tubular transport and mechanism. First, one important mechanism is increased secretion of hydrogen ions by renal tubular cells. The kidneys actively transport hydrogen ions from the blood into the tubular fluid. This allows the body to eliminate excess acid through the urine. The secreted hydrogen ion cannot remain free in large amount because urine pH cannot decrease indefinitely. Therefore, hydrogen ions are excreted with urinary buffers. This includes phosphate and ammonia-based buffering system. By increasing hydrogen ion secretion, the kidneys contribute to the removal of excess acid from the body. Bicarbonate is an important extracellular buffer. Normally, a large amount of bicarbonate is filtered through the glomeruli, but the most of it is reabsorbed by the renal tubules. During chronic respiratory acidosis, the kidneys increase bicarbonate conservation. As more bicarbonate is reabsorbed and retained in the blood, plasma bicarbonate concentration increases. This increased bicarbonate helps buffer excess hydrogen ions and partially compensates for the elevated PaCO2. Therefore, increased bicarbonate reabsorption leads to increased plasma bicarbonate, then it leads to partial correction of pH. The kidneys not only conserve filtered bicarbonate but can also generate new bicarbonate. This process is especially important during chronic acid loading. For every hydrogen ion that is effectively exerted from the body as ammonium or titratable acid, a corresponding amount of new bicarbonate can be added to the blood. This newly generated bicarbonate increases the buffering capacity of extracellular fluid. Thus, increased acid excretion by the kidney leads to generation of new bicarbonate, then it leads to increased plasma bicarbonate concentration. This mechanism is one of the major reasons why bicarbonate levels are significantly higher in chronic respiratory acidosis than in acute respiratory acidosis. Then, ammonium excretion is an extremely important mechanism of renal acid elimination. Renal tubular cells metabolize the amino acid glutamine. This process produces ammonia, represented as NH3, and also contributes to bicarbonate generation. Ammonia can combine with secreted hydrogen ions. The resulting ammonium ion is less able to diffuse back across the tubular membrane and is therefore effectively trapped in the tubular fluid. It can then be excreted in the urine. This process is sometimes referred to as ion trapping. By increasing ammonium excretion, the kidneys can remove larger amounts of hydrogen ions from the body. At the same time, this process contributes to the addition of new bicarbonate to the blood. Therefore, ammonium excretion is a highly effective mechanism for the long-term renal compensation of respiratory acidosis. Thank you for listening and watching my video.